This is a Roqe Media series, The Contemporary History of Iran, Part 26. Hi there, and welcome to the Contemporary History of Iran, a series from Roqe Media. This is Part 26, Khomeinism. I'm Jian Ghomeshi. Our aim with this series is to explore the events, personalities, and issues that have shaped modern Iran. We want to do this as much as possible through a non-traditional lens, through snapshots of change, and using alternative voices or angles. This series is mostly in English and will feature a new episode posted every Thursday across our Roqe Media platforms. We will post subtitled excerpts with Farsi Zirnavis on our YouTube and Instagram sites. We are coming to you on roqemedia.com. It is there that you can link to all of our platforms, and we invite you to check out parts 1 through 25 of this series that are already posted. To become a sponsor or patron of Roqe Media, please contact us through our website. All right, let's get started. Here now is the Contemporary History of Iran, Part 26. Well, of all the figures of modern Iranian history, and perhaps global history in the 20th century, few have a name and image that draws more of a reflexive reaction than the man who came to power in 1979 in Iran, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. He's either seen as a revolutionary spiritual hero or a barbaric throwback dictator, but he certainly inspires no shortage of opinions. So, who was the man that led the creation of the Islamic Republic, which remains the regime in power in Iran today? And was he, in fact, a fundamentalist clergyman or a shrewd populist? And how, despite a decade of turbulence in Iran, did he stay in power until his death in 1989? In short, what was Khomeinism? I'm joined once again today for a second episode of 2 with an esteemed featured guest who has been described as one of the preeminent Iranian historians of his generation and a leading historian on modern Iran. Dr. Yermand Abrahamian is a renowned Iranian-American scholar and author. He is the Distinguished Professor of Iranian and Middle Eastern History and Politics at the City University of New York. He is also a member of the International Iranian Studies Association, the American Historical Association, and the Middle East Studies Association of North America. Dr. Abrahamian was born in Tehran and grew up partly in Iran, partly in England. He received his bachelor's and master's degrees from Oxford University and his doctorate from Columbia University in New York. He has in the past taught at Princeton, New York University, and Oxford. He is the author of several acclaimed books on 20th century Iran, including his celebrated book, Iran Between Two Revolutions, which is a standard text for the study of modern Iran now. Dr. Abrahamian's latest book, Oil Crisis in Iran, From Nationalism to Coup d'etat, was published last year. And right now, it's a great pleasure to have Dr. Yermand Abrahamian join me from New York today. Hello, sir.
Thank you, Jian, for the introduction. Thank you.
Great to have you back. And this is a meaty one, of course. There's a lot to say about Khomeini, and I'm not sure we can comprehensively cover his whole life and political story in just 1 hour, but we can try to scratch the surface, as you've written quite a great deal about him and, of course, the revolution of '79. Let me start our conversation and set the stage by quoting you in your book on Khomeini. And this is, you say, My argument is that Khomeinism should be seen as a flexible political movement expressing socioeconomic grievances, not simply as a religious crusade obsessed with scriptural texts, spiritual purity, and theological dogma. So your case is that Khomeini was not a fundamentalist, or not just a fundamentalist, as he is often seen. To most of the world, fundamentalist and Khomeini are synonymous. So in general terms, to begin, in what way was Khomeini not a fundamentalist?
Well, when he appeared in the American press, he was always labeled as Islamic fundamentalist. And of course, the word fundamentalism was already around because of Christian fundamentalism. But the whole notion that Khomeini was popular and had such a charismatic appeal was always traced to that he was really rejecting science, the modern world, rejecting basically technology and wanting to return to the fundamentals of Islam, return to early Mecca, Medina, and therefore he was a rejection of the modern world and a return to something in the past, and that he was obsessed with religious texts, interpreting the text literally, and accepting the text as being the absolute truth expressed by God. So it was seen as a mirror image of Christian fundamentalism. And at that time, the word fundamentalism was branded around. It became a sort of a sponge word that soaked up many meanings, but often it was applied to this type of rigid, dogmatic, looking back to the past. And my argument was that this was really could not explain why Khomeini had such charismatic appeal and there was such a mass movement in the Iranian Revolution. Majority of Iranians were not rejecting science, modern medicine, the modern world, and trying to go back to 7th century Mecca, Medina. And therefore you had to look at what Khomeini was actually saying, what was his public persona, and therefore look at his socio-economic expressions of grievances to explain why he was popular. And the word fundamentalism is actually something that is dropped out of the English political language. Nowadays, you rarely hear the word fundamentalism either for Christians or Islamicists. Often, actually, now, if you're talking about return to early Islam, people talk about Islamicists or political Islam or ISIS or Bin Ladenists, and also there's been a transformation. Christian fundamentalists have become evangelicals, and the reason for this is actually tied to Islam, because during the Islamic Revolution in Iran, and then of course later with this 9/11. The word fundamentalism was so much stuck to Muslims that Christian fundamentalists actually objected and didn't want to be associated with the same concept. That there was lobbying. There was a very intense lobbying by Christian fundamentalists not to be called fundamentalists, so they became now evangelicals.
But if Khomeini, again, just in general terms, because I'm going to ask you about some of the details as you outline them in your book of why you make this argument. But if Khomeini was not just a fundamentalist and in fact was a populist, in what ways was he a populist?
Well, the language he used, which really didn't exist in traditional Islam or Shia's Islam, is the retort to mustazafin, the wretched of the earth, the poor, the sans-culottes, the subaltern classes of society and their grievances against the rich. So he often had this image of society. This is at the height of the revolution.
Yes.
Seeing basically the Iran divided as the shanty dwellers versus the palace dwellers. And he represented, from his point of view, the poor, the wretched, the mustazafin, the shanty dwellers, and their grievances against the elite, the rich, the powerful, the oppressors.
But if part of what you establish in your book about Khomeinism is this dismissal of the notion of the Iranian Revolution being rooted simply in fundamentalist Islam, and rather by the time Khomeini and his followers were mounting their challenge to the Shah's regime, they're using the language and political techniques of radical populism. If we accept that, and we accept that this was a popular revolution, including a middle-class revolution, how did Khomeini manage to sell the masses on the discourse of an idea of Islam at all?
Well, you could say Islam was part of the Iranian culture, mass culture, so it resonated when he talked about Islam. But what he was very careful, and this is where his shrewd populism comes in, during the revolution, he never revealed what his real plan was and intentions. That was kept very close to his chest. Only a few people around his closest disciples knew what his agenda was. So he was appealing to the public on a very populist, even radical slogans. And this was the persona he was known as. But his real thinking, which was a book called, or lectures called Valeta Factory, the rule of the jurist, where he really spelled out what later became the Islamic Republic, which was not just an Islamic Republic, but a clerical republic.
Right. So even if he's using Islam in the early parts of the revolution, he's using a very elastic version of that. It includes the emancipation of women and, this sort of nirvana of democracy and freedom, right? Under the rubric of Islam. I want to come to the details of that period and the actual kinds of policies and mission that he pursues that underscores this populism. But before we do that, let's go backwards, and if you can, give us a quick debrief on the man before he becomes known to the world in the 60s and then, of course, the 70s and 80s. Who was Khomeini? You know, the Islamic Republic, it occurs to me, has done its very best to portray Ayatollah Khomeini as the quintessential man of the people. The idea is that he's born into a humble family and lost his father in infancy and then rises like the phoenix through the clerical hierarchy purely because of his scholastic abilities and devoting his adult life to the struggle against the Pahlavi regime, leaving behind for his surviving son only one worldly possession, a family prayer rug. Where does the truth lie in who Khomeini really was?
He's an enigma, and intentionally he made himself an enigma. I can't find anyone in history, major figure in history, that was so basically controlled about his public image, even before he became a public figure. It's very hard to find out actually what he was doing until really 1964, 63. Any information about the early period, he tightly controlled. So people can later say, oh, he was, allied with this person or that person. And it's all speculation because we know very little about what he was doing. Certain things we know. He was a disciple and a student of Grand Ayatollah Khomeini. And then later he was very close to Grand Ayatollah Borujerdi. So he rose up through the clerical hierarchy with these two Grand Ayatollahs who were very well known as apolitical, or the term that's often used, quietist, that they didn't want to get involved in politics. So, being under their patronage, he clearly was not going to stick his head out in politics. So we don't know what his politics were, whether he was actually against Mossadegh, pro-Kashani, or whatever. He basically was very much in the background. So all we can say is he was a typical cleric, ambitious and careful not to cross his patrons, either Grand Ayatollah Hayri or Burujerdi. It's after Burujerdi dies in 61 that he really comes out in the political arena. And it's at that point he's not anti-Shah. He's not even revolutionary.
Yeah.
He basically makes his stand on a nationalist issue, which is the so-called capitulations, giving American military advisors extrajudicial powers, i.e., protection from Iranian law. And that was.
Let me come to the 60s. Just before we do that, though, I mean, part of the case that you make is that Khomeini transitions or transforms throughout the course of his lifetime, and that political shrewdness grows as he grows. Just, I mean, with the disclaimer of having said what you've said about us not knowing a lot about him when in his earlier years, what is your sense of whether the Khomeini who came to be the leader or figurehead of a revolution in 1979 would have recognized the 20-something version of himself?
I think he would be very conscious as being a cleric. And being a cleric, he clearly would have the grievances of most clerics on the new state created by the Pahlavis. So going back to Reza Shah, the marginalization of the clerical establishment, this would have, I think, rubbed him the wrong way, as it would have done with most of the clerics of that time. But that didn't mean necessarily was anti-monarchist or radical at that period in his 20s.
Before we get to 1963 and Khomeini's significant entry into politics, then, in our last shot, Dr. Abrahamian, we talked about Mossadegh and the 1953 coup, and you made the case that Mohammad Reza Pahlavi actually had great foresight in understanding that the overthrow of Mossadegh could and would lead to the end of the monarchy in Iran. It seems like a stretch on the face of it, but popular revolutions don't happen overnight. In what way do you believe that the events of the early 1950s would actually set the stage for Khomeini?
Well, I don't think he would have, 53 would have affected him, because he probably wasn't, at that time, non-radical enough not to get involved in politics. So he probably would have done what Burujerdi did, which was basically accept the 53 coup and, take reality. And the first real time that Khomeini actually publishes something political, it's not under his name, but we can know now it's on. He criticizes Reza Shah for not taking the advice of the clerics, and saying that basically the clerics want to give advice because they want to preserve the monarchy. So he's a monarchist at that time. So he wants the monarchy be more reliant on the clerical establishment. He's not asking anything more. And it's not till really after 60s that he comes out and becomes even more critical. But even then, he's not actually calling for the destruction of the monarchy.
I've seen you at some point say that after Mossadegh was effectively sidelined, Khomeini emerges as the new national leader of the opposition, basically, in Iran. When would you date that to?
That I would mention the capitulations, 63, 64.
So what happens in 63? I mean, this is Khomeini's, as I said, significant entry into politics, and it's amidst the Shah's reforms known as the White Revolution. What leads to Khomeini being arrested and detained at that time?
Well, here again, his I think shrewdness and political savvy. The White Revolution, 72, 73. Many of the 62, yeah. Many of the clerics then opposed the land reform. And they were then, of course, the Shah could brush the clerical establishments as being anti-reform, or especially land reform. Khomeini was actually shrewd enough not to take the issue of land reform a central issue. He took the central issue as the capitulations and giving of these privileges to American military advisors, and therefore basically making his pitch on a nationalistic grounds rather than anti-reform grounds.
It's something that's I find fascinating, and you mentioned it a few moments ago, but that you outline in your book, is that, if I understand this correctly, Khomeini was not a revolutionary in the 1940s, 50s, even in the 60s, and rather retained pretty traditional attitudes towards the state. Even in 1963, when he emerges as the most vocal anti-regime cleric, he doesn't call for a revolution or the overthrow of the monarchy. Rather, he's kind of castigating the Shah for secularism and modernist reforms, and as you say, anti-nationalism. When and how do Khomeini's attitudes begin to get more strident in terms of then calling for any removal of the Pahlavi regime?
Well, the first clear indication is in 1970. He gives a number of lectures in Najaf, in exile. These lectures then become a book called Valeta Factory, Hukumat Islami. And here, the first time you really see him calling for the elimination of the monarchy and the establishment of, at that time, he doesn't call it a republic, but an Islamic state. So it's 1970 is the time, but these lectures were actually not well known. These were, again, because if you read them, what they're arguing is for a clerical state. And of course, he didn't want the public to know him as someone who wanted a clerical dictatorship. He wanted to be known as much more as a populist. So these lectures were not well circulated. And during the revolution, no one ever talked about Valeta Factory. That term was only came in after the revolution, i.e. when he had power and it came to writing a constitution, then you can say he revealed his true cards, and then his disciples basically wrote a constitution that was modeled on his lectures, Valeta Factory.
And just to be clear, the Valeta Factory declares in no uncertain terms that Islam is inherently incompatible with all forms of monarchy, right?
Yes, he argues basically the prophets came to denounce monarchies, that Moses was not just against that particular pharaoh, he was against all pharaohs. And there has been never a monarch who's been just. He even says Anushirvan, who is usually known as Anushirvan the Just in Iran, even Anushirvan was unjust.
And so then presumably Muslims have a sacred duty to oppose all monarchies.
Yes.
Right.
I mean, but this was completely new, of course, because both in Sunni and Shia Islam, monarchy was accepted as the normal form of government. You don't hear earlier Islamic thinkers talking about a republic.
So you kind of helped me there a moment ago, because I was trying to square the circle between Khomeini doing these lectures in 1970, the Valeta Factory, and which is a revolutionary statement around wanting to create a theocratic rule, and then the case that you've made that Khomeini through the 60s into the 70s becomes more attuned to messaging that is more palatable and popular to intellectuals and the left in Iran. So I'm thinking, well, how can both of those things be true? How can he be appealing to the intellectuals on the left and at the same time doing the speeches on Valeta Factory? But I guess because the Valeta Factory was not popularly known, is that the idea?
Yeah, I mean, one of his disciples later argued that the book and the notions of Valeta Factory were not well known because there was a conspiracy between some of Khomeini's supporters like Bani Sadr, Qutbzadeh, Yazdi, and Marxists to keep the book basically hidden. And this is obviously an absurd accusation. Those people and the Marxists had no power to censor the book. If Khomeini and Khomeini's disciples wanted to circulate that book, they wouldn't have been stopped. Those people didn't have the power to stop them. The reason Valeta Factory was not well known was, I think, intentional for Khomeini and his supporters. That they didn't want to reveal, or what they wanted was a very rigid clerical state.
Right. It makes sense to me that Bani Sadr or Yazdi would want to bury it. Whether they played any role in censoring the book or not, that seems absurd. But I could understand why they wouldn't want that out there. I mean,
Qutbzadeh actually once said he had never heard of the term Valeta Factory till after the revolution. And also, there's if you actually look at the original edition of Valeta Factory, it doesn't have Khomeini's name on it. It has a pseudonym. And at that time, if you ask people, well, these are these really Khomeini's ideas, the answer would have been, well, these are lecture notes from students, and you can never rely on student lecture notes. And any professor would have agreed with that.
But was the Valeta Factory entirely Khomeini's idea, or is it borrowed from centuries earlier?
No, the term Valeta Factory has a long tradition in Shia Islam, not in Sunni Islam. What it means is the authority of senior clerics. But it's the authority, basically, of senior clerics to be supervisors of the mentally incapable widows who don't have male custodians and orphans. So this was a term that was often used basically for clerics to have jurisdiction over, you can say, people who needed jurisdiction. So there was a long tradition of this. But what Khomeini was doing was extending this to not just to widows, the mentally incapable orphans, but the whole population. The argument is the whole population needed the guidance of the clerics. So again, it's an old term, but it gives it a very different content. And many people, of course, didn't realize that. I think the people who really realized it were the other senior clerics, like Ayatollah Shariat Madari and Golpaye Ghani, who were much more traditional and realized that this went counter to the traditional notion of what Valeta Factory meant.
Let me ask you about Khomeini's shrewdness and political acumen as the revolution happens. Part of Khomeini's populism is in the discourse he ends up employing, right? And so how did Khomeini break from Shiite traditions and borrow radical rhetoric from foreign sources, I'm thinking including Marxism, to present this bold appeal to the public based not on theological themes, but on real economic, social, political grievances?
We know that this Rhetoric by 1977-78, he incorporates a lot of even Marxist rhetoric about the Mustazafin and the oppressed and so on. But he never footnotes, obviously, where he's getting his ideas or his terminology from. So he wants to be purely authentic. He's not going to go to leftist sources or foreign sources to say, footnote them. All we can say, speculate, is that in the 70s, in exile, he was often visited by student leaders from the Confederation. And he obviously read a lot of exiled newspapers, published by National Front in Paris, in Beirut. And these ideas of radical notions would have seeped through. And of course, in Iraq itself at that time, there was a lot of Shia radicalism because the Iraqi Communist Party was very influential, and the Shia clerics in Iraq had to compete with the Iraqi Communist Party, so they incorporated a lot of Marxist rhetoric into their discourse. So I think one can speculate that this type of influences he absorbed and he obviously selectively brought into his own language.
And how does that lead to, and how does that play on for the population? How does it lead, in what way is it appealing in terms of those social and economic grievances, for example?
Well, because there were so many grievances, social economic grievances in Iran, especially in the lower classes, working classes, and also, of course, in the bazaar, this basically tapped into them. And of course, this language also was being circulated within Iran by Muslim intellectuals such as Shariati, who was also absorbing a lot of Marxist language into his thinking.
Yes.
So Khomeini obviously read Shariati. He again is not going to praise Shariati or pay lip service to him, but he knew that people were reading Shariati and Shariati was popular, so he would have really borrowed things from Shariati he thought had the popular appeal.
Dr. Abrahamian, you've written a lot and spoken a lot about Khomeini's commitment to the preservation of middle-class private property. Why is that so important?
Because how radical he is in his polemics. He is not willing to go to the, I would say, the line, red line between middle-class radicalism and socialism, which is that socialism property can be distributed for public good. For middle-class radicalism, property is still sacred. Private property should not be violated. So that becomes the central notion in liberalism or middle-class radicalism. So you often find, even in Latin American, however populist people are, like Perón, he does not actually violate sanctity of private property. He doesn't expropriate land from huge plantation owners and so on. So in a way, the Shah was much more radical in that he was willing to take land from big feudal landowners and distribute it. But radical populists would find that not palatable, because as long as property is earned lawfully, and according to Khomeini it would be according to Shia regulations, then that property is sacred and should not be violated.
And so middle-class propertied citizens feel less threatened by a new regime.
Yes, Yeah, unless you're a member of a minority, and then you could say they could argue that, well, you didn't follow Xi regulations, and therefore this was unearned property. But the question of limitations on property actually became a political issue, and here again you see the limitations of Khomeini's radicalism. After the revolution, the question was, should there be a ceiling on how much farmers could have in farmland? Or should their large farms distributed so there would be more of equality among peasants and you would have small farms? And this became a major ideological dispute between, I would say, much more socialistic Islamic radicals who were more than willing to have a limitation on the ceiling on how much farmers could have, while the conservatives argued no, that would be a violation of private property. If the farmer had accumulated a lot of land in the proper way, then Islam had to protect that property. And there was a back and forth discussion about that. Eventually, of course, the conservatives won. There was no limit put on ownership of property.
There's such an interesting intersection here with an episode we did about a month ago on secularism in Iran post-revolution. And it was with Dr. Pargu, who I presume you know. And his case was, saying that, he was also speaking about the shrewdness of Khomeini when Khomeini realizes that he can't be some sort of mystical, religious, symbolic leader and preside over a functioning modern state at the same time. And given the choice, errs more on the side of being the leader of a modern state.
Yes, and in this case also, I think on the side of private property, which means basically the propertied middle class, yeah.
And yet he's kind of playing all sides, isn't he? Because he, as we've been saying, Khomeinism adopts many of the tenets of class warfare to make an appeal to the workers. That is, like, on the one hand, claiming to reject the West, and on the other hand, adopting things like International Workers' Day. It feels like nothing could be more incongruous with an Islamic state than May Day, but it's certainly shrewd. What did it mean to the general population that May Day becomes a thing?
Well, I mean, I think for the average person, it says, okay, this Islamic Republic is radical. Khomeini is serious about his radicalism. Without people actually, of course, having not read Valeta Factory's book or knowing that his sentiments are very much still conservative in terms of protection of private property. Another part of his shrewdness on a modern state is whenever put in a corner, Khomeini himself does not come down clearly on one side. He does the typical political thing. He sets up a committee. And then, of course, appoints people in the committee, knowing well how people are going to vote, so that the committee then makes the final decision, is responsible for it. So radicals can still say, well, Khomeini would have supported distribution of property among poor peasants. It was others who blocked this and sabotaged it. It was some committee that they set up.
It's interesting, isn't it? There's dictators that revel in being dictators, and then this is a dictator who wants to appear that he's not, right?
Yeah, yes, or not have take responsibility for a decision that may not be popular.
You mentioned Peron a few moments ago, and you've argued that Khomeinism, despite its religious dimension, in many ways resembles Latin American populism. How so?
Well, I think, again, it's a radical rhetoric, but behind the Catholic rhetoric is still the weddedness to private property. And of course, the big difference is, of course, in the South American, it's not the clerical aspect is not there. For Khomeini, clerical aspect is very important. It's just he doesn't reveal it till after the revolution.
You say that in the 1982 to 1989 period, so post first years of the revolution and final 7 years of Khomeini's life, that Khomeini toned down his language and focused on institutionalizing the revolution, building the Islamic Republic, which increasingly, as we've been saying, took the shape of a propertied middle-class republic. Are we overstating the tone down bit? I mean, he certainly didn't tone things down when it came to his messianic zeal for involvement in the Iran-Iraq War or mass execution of political prisoners in 1988. I mean, what does tone down mean in that context?
There actually, I mean, it's not a smooth movement. I think it's more zigzags. During Rafsanjani's period, when he was president, clearly there was a thermidor toning down. Rafsanjani would have wanted to basically normalize relations with the West, have an economic boom, bring in Western oil companies and so on, basically stabilize the regime by prosperity. And that would have been a typical thermidor. But then I think there was conflict within the regime between those who wanted to export the revolution, continue the fervor of the revolution. And so it's back and forth. Of course, the Iraqi war also complicated issues. I think that created for some people a lot of disillusionment. And there, of course, Khomeini was not politically shrewd. I think his biggest mistake in his career was continuing the war after Khorramshahr was liberated and taking the war into Iraq. That really, I think, undermined the appeal of the Iranian Revolution and lost a lot of support within the country.
Yes. There's another paradox. Help me figure this out. I mean, if we take your argument that the reason Khomeinism survived for the decade until he died was not because of religious slogans or an Islamic mission, but that it fulfilled social and economic expectations by bringing modernization infrastructure to rural areas of Iran, so the gap between urban and rural begins to close. If we accept all of that, which I think makes a lot of sense and is a compelling argument, there's part of me that niggles as well, though, that says, didn't the Islamic Republic actually survive because it's a very repressive and controlled police state? I mean, how do you how can we give props to the fulfilling economic expectations when we know that anybody who acted out against this regime would have been shut down pretty heavily?
Yeah, no, I mean, one shouldn't minimize the repression and the violence or the regime's willingness to use violence. But regimes can't really survive purely by terror. They need some sort of legitimacy. And I think with the Khomeini regime, it's legitimate partly because the revolution was popular. But I think even equally important is that after the revolution, at least in the first 30 years, the regime did succeed in bringing in some benefits for the mass of the rural population. So that it wasn't not completely irrational for many people in the villages to continue supporting the regime, even when it became quite oppressive against the opposition. Things may have changed then after, in the more last 10 years, because I think the benefits have sort of now taken as basically for granted. And there's been a drying up of new benefits. and economic, basically, difficulties have eroded that part of the appeal of the regime. So the regime is only legitimacy left is the original appeal of the revolution, but of course as time goes by, that becomes less important.
Do you think Khomeini believed his own rhetoric? I know this is a tough question. It's like the current trend is to ask pundits about what Putin is thinking, as if everybody can guess what Vladimir Putin is thinking. But if you were to take a guess at it, when you say, Khomeini's idea is that the Islamic Republic would be basically like a democratic society, but that the guidance of the society would be in the hands of clerics, and of course he'd be appointed leader for life. Do you think that was lip service, or do you think he actually believed that he was bringing democracy?
Well, again, actually, you have to look carefully when he says, democracy or people will be free. He always qualified it as long as they abide by Islam. That's a big qualification. Who defines what is Islam? He defines it. So even the terms that in Paris, where he sounds very democratic and, everyone will be free and stuff, there's always this qualification in his statements. So I think he did believe it, but the listeners obviously didn't hear that part of his statement.
You're right that he's incredibly controlled, isn't he? There's few sort of words out of place from his mission throughout a relatively long lifetime.
Yes, yeah. And also, you see that whenever he deals with even Iraqi officials, he always does it through interpreters. He must have known enough Arabic to be able to speak with local officials, but he always had the protection of interpreters. And in these interviews in Paris also, it's very controlled. And if he didn't like any question, he wouldn't answer the question.
It's as ever energizing and educational getting to talk to you. A final question, and I suppose it's a sort of $1 million question, but you first wrote Khomeinism in the 1990s. A lot has changed since then. What do you believe the legacy of the approach and tactics of Ayatollah Khomeini, Khomeinism, if you will, what is that legacy over 30 years since his death?
Well, I think the legacy isn't not that much because, unlike most revolutions, this revolution really did not have appeal outside Iran and the Shia world. Although it claimed to be Islamic, the language was so Shia, especially the notion of Valeta Factory, that it's not a revolution for export. So the whole fear that existed in 79, 80s that this revolution was going to spread throughout the Middle East and become a worldwide Islamic revolution, that just didn't work out. There's no legacy of that left. So when the Arab Springs came, you don't have any echo of the Iranian Revolution in the Arab Springs. In fact, the Arab rebels, the last thing they wanted to do is be associated with the Khomeini Revolution.
Right. What about the actual tenets of Khomeinism? Did that shrewd political awareness of the rural and urban and all that we've discussed, how long does that remain after he dies, or is it still there today?
No, I think what has become is the more conservative elements, especially both in the clerics and the bazaar, have become more dominant. So, of course, that the radical rhetoric has disappeared, except for on the question of the U.S. and Israel. But social radicalism has basically diminished. So you have a great deal of economic inequality in Iran, probably more so now than even before the revolution, and that obviously is not part of the legacy of the revolution, that it's brought a more of an egalitarian society. And also, there were, I think, during the revolution, there were fundamentalists in the movement. It's just Khomeini himself was not a fundamentalist. But more fundamentalist elements have become more predominant as time has gone on, so that you have a hardening of actually intellectual thought. Periods where it is opening, like during Khatemi's time, but on the whole, it's the intellectual fervent and discussions that you had in the early years, that has really diminished and just become much more claustrophobic.
How do you see, as an historian, the view of Khomeini shifting in the 40 years since he came to power, and in 3 years since he's died? And what do you think? Where do you think that image, that impression of Khomeini, will go into the future?
Well, it's when you have someone who's so, you can say, flexible and pragmatic, it's hard to find a central core that you can say later on people are going to find appealing. The central core is, of course, in Khomeini, is the clerical aspect, clerical rule. And that's not something that's going to, I think, have much appeal either now or in the future. It's not something assailable for other societies or even for Iran.
Interesting. It was an interesting answer. What about his? You, in the very beginning of our chat today, you mentioned charisma. Do you think, I didn't ask you this before, I should ask you it for the sake of it, what is your sense of why he was so charismatic? On the face of it, he doesn't seem that charismatic. Seems like, certainly for a Western kid growing up, he seemed like an angry old man, but he clearly was charismatic enough to move millions, right? So what was it?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up charisma. I don't deal with it really much in the book. But the more I've thought about it and read Max Weber, he really fits into Max Weber's notion of charisma, being someone. It's not the person himself that creates charisma, it's the situation that permits someone becoming charismatic. And according to Max Weber, people obey for basically two major reasons. They obey because of tradition, what the established law tells you, custom. And then there's the modern type of obeying because institutions, modern law tells you to obey. Now, so there's these two forms of legitimacy. But if there is no normal legitimacy, there's a breakdown of legitimacy, there's a vacuum, then you could have, for Max Weber, prophets appearing. For him, charisma is something supernatural, comes from God, some beyond. It's the person then speaks, and what he says is more important than what custom tradition has said. And of course, it's before there is a institutional, modern, bureaucratic legitimacy. So I think what in Iran happens is after 53, when legitimacy breaks down because of the coup, there's a vacuum of legitimacy. And even the constitutional revolution becomes illegitimate. So in this vacuum of lack of legitimacy, that Khomeini appears and says, well, I know the law, I am the person who can set the things in order, and I have authority beyond basically either tradition or bureaucracy. So I can say, I can set the law. So in Christianity, you have Jesus saying, well, the law tells you this, but I tell you something else. And what I tell you is more important than the traditional law tells you. And that's what real charisma is. And people then listen to that person because he is setting up a new form of legitimacy.
Oh, it blows my mind. That is such an interesting take in an age of Instagram where we we assume charisma is pearly white teeth and walking on the red carpet. This is a really interesting take on charisma. Partly being the person at the right moment in history saying the appropriate thing that is going to move the masses.
Yeah. And also basically saying, don't listen to the past, don't listen to bureaucrats, don't listen to people who are in authority. I'm the real authority.
But you have to believe, I mean, I don't know, you tell me. I would assume part of that is you have to believe the authenticity of the person, right? If you don't think they're authentic, the charisma isn't so shiny.
Yeah, and also I think this ties into his radical rhetoric, that's appealing to people, and they're willing to follow him because he seems to be promising things that they want.
Dr. Yermand Abrahamian, it's been a great pleasure. I thank you again for this.
I enjoyed very much talking to you. Thank you very much, Jian.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Dr. Yermand Abrahamian is a renowned Iranian-American scholar and author and the distinguished professor of Iranian and Middle Eastern history and politics at the City University of New York. His latest book, Oil Crisis in Iran, From Nationalism to Coup d'etat, was published last year. Dr. Yermand Abrahamian joined me from New York City today. This is full time for the Roqe Media series, The Contemporary History of Iran, Part 26. Please check out our regular editions of Roqe and all things related at our website, the hub of all things Roqe, roqemedia.com. roqemedia.com, where you can also become a patron of our program. Thanks to the team who make Roqe Media happen: talented Anahita, Super Patty Saw, Ponta the Artist, Savvy Roham, Aghay Mehrdad, the fabulous Kian, Captain Reza, and Groovy Shaya. Thank you to all of you out there for supporting us and sharing our content. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already. Find me on Instagram at Jian Ghomeshi. Mizun Bashin.